Most of us cannot help but compare ourselves to others. And we know it's probably not a helpful practice, but we do it anyway. We compare ourselves to others, kind of hoping we'll come out on top, but knowing that we'll always find someone who's doing things better than we are. Now, I have shared ministry with congregations whose members like to compare themselves to other members. They compare how much they give to how much they are certain someone else is giving. They compare how often they are in worship with how often someone else is in worship. They compare their troubles, their problems, and their faith in surviving life to someone else who may not be doing it quite as smoothly. They compare hoping to bolster their sense of righteousness by comparing themselves to others. Now, I know this because people have come to me to share their comparisons, especially when they come out looking better, of course. And I'm happy, very happy to report that no one has had that kind of conversation with me here at Lakeshore. You may have had it amongst yourselves, but you haven't felt the need to share it with me. Thank you. But I got to tell you, it's really tempting to compare ourselves to others. Now, in the story Jesus told this morning, two men were at the temple courtyard praying out loud. Now, praying out loud in public in the temple courtyard was common. In fact, it still is today. The Wailing Wall, which is the only wall of the temple that exists, is a place where faithful Orthodox Jews and others come to pray, and they pray out loud. People still go there to pray. Now, one of the men praying in this particular story was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. Now, in spite of things I've said in the past or thought in the past, and in spite of what many of us have been taught to think, in the first century, Pharisees were very well regarded. They were the popular priests, they were the popular rabbis, because they were out in the countryside teaching others. And they were thought of as people who were keeping the laws of Moses extraordinarily well. Now, Jesus didn't agree with all the add-ons that they tried to put, and that's where they got into debates. But Jesus himself was of the Pharisee denomination. So in spite of what most of us have heard, in spite of what I've said in the past, Pharisees were really faithful men doing their best to show strict obedience to God. Now, tax collectors were Jews who worked for Rome, which immediately, for that reason alone, made them despised by every other faithful Jew. They were regarded as traitors to their own people because they worked for that evil other. They worked for Rome. And those listening to Jesus would have been cheering for the Pharisee while booing for the tax collector. Now, the Pharisee was praying in the priest's court. See, the temple had, do we have that? No. The temple was like a series of rectangles. The temple with the room where the Ark of the Covenant lived was the only spot where only the chief priest could go. Then there was another courtyard, then another courtyard. And that courtyard was where the priest prayed. The next courtyard was where the men prayed. The next was where the women prayed. And the courtyard that went all the way around was where the Gentiles could hang out selling wares. Yeah, I mean, it's like every place else. You got to have somebody to support the customers. And so the Pharisees would pray in one courtyard, and the men's courtyard was right behind. Now, when it says the Pharisee was praying, he was probably up as close to the altar as he could get, because that was a prime spot. It was a holy place, and he wanted to feel close to God. The tax collector was probably, when they say far off, in the farthest corner away. But they were still next door to each other. So we've got the Pharisee who's praying out loud in front of the altar, and the tax collector who's praying out loud farther away in the men's courtyard. And chances are they were standing alone and as far from each other as they could get. People who prayed in temple courtyards simply did not expect anyone else to listen to them. Their prayer was private between themselves and God, and if anybody else was listening in, it's because they weren't doing their own prayers. There's a practice in South Korea of Tongsung Kido. I can't say it in spite of having a South Korean colleague. I can't say it the same way. Tongsung Kido. And Tongsung Kido is still practiced in South Korea today, where people in the congregation are invited to pray their prayers out loud. participated in it once, and I actually shut up long enough to listen to what it sounded like. And it sounds like a babbling brook. All the voices saying their own prayers going up to God. So think of this babbling brook where we've got a Pharisee here, we've got the tax collector there, probably some people in between, and they're all praying out loud, not listening to each other. Now these men had no way of trying to compare themselves to each other because they were immersed in their own prayers. They were just praying. The Pharisee was there to pray for the well-being of the community, and he did that by being extraordinarily uber faithful. The tax collector was in there praying because he knew he needed help to do better. And in the story, Jesus shares the contents of the two men's prayers. And the first listeners would have known by what the Pharisee was saying that he had gone above and beyond what was expected of him. He fasted more often than was expected. He gave 1/10 of his really considerable income to God through the work of the temple. And when it came to faith, this guy got an A++. At the same time, they would have expected the tax collector to pray exactly the way he did, because he worked for Rome, and everybody listening knew that he needed mercy for all of the sins that he had committed. Mercy and then some. Now, Luke's commentary around that story reflects Luke's point of view. Luke had no problem putting words into Jesus' mouth, and he did so regularly. He was also a Gentile, so while he was a God-fearer and a follower of Jesus, he had never been a Pharisaic Jew. He had never been an Orthodox Jew. So while Jesus talked about humility for those who thought too well of themselves and respect for those who were humble, that was not the point Jesus was trying to make. The author of Luke wasn't there for the first telling of any of Jesus' stories, so he put words into Jesus' mouth quite often. This story wants us to remember that we are in this faith together. Like it or not, we're in it together. And some days we will be like the Pharisee. We'll be about as close to sainthood on earth as we can get. We'll be extraordinarily faithful. We'll do more than is expected. And other days, we're going to be a whole lot like the tax collector, when we need mercy and forgiveness and a whole lot more. Some days we will lift each other up by our prayers and actions, while other days we're going to need others to lift us up by their prayers and their actions. This story wants us to remember that we are in this faith together. And there will be days when people would listen to us pray out loud if they did and think, oh, A++. And there would be days when if we prayed out loud, others would say, woo, you need help, honey. And other days the roles would switch. We're in it together. Now, as I said before, I don't hear people in this congregation comparing ourselves to each other, but I do hear us comparing ourselves to people in other congregations. I do hear us comparing ourselves to people who have different political beliefs. I do hear us comparing ourselves to people who hold different theological beliefs. And we compare ourselves usually to feel better about ourselves. We enjoy that feeling of moral superiority. And we compare ourselves to just assure ourselves that we're doing a better job at living our faith than to those people with whom we don't agree, who hold different religious, political, and theological beliefs. And when we do that, we have forgotten that we're all in this together. We've forgotten that we're all on the same side. We have forgotten that we have been put on this earth to serve God by serving God's people, all of God's people, and by serving God's creation, all of God's creation. We've forgotten that ultimately, if we want to have the mind of God, that we want what is best for each other, even when our methods for achieving that goal are different. When we compare ourselves for the sake of feeling morally superior, we have forgotten that we are Christians, followers of Jesus Christ, citizens of the world, and believers who are in this life together. So I think the moral of this particular story from Jesus is to live our faith in ways that help pull each other up rather than put each other down. And even when somebody else we know is putting us down. Our job is to help them get pulled up to a different way of looking at it. Because as soon as we join each other in doing comparisons that make the other look worse, as my mom would say, we're all playing in the mud and nobody gets out clean. Now, if you've ever watched basketball, anybody ever watch basketball? Then you will have noticed that when a player goes to the free throw line and misses, the other players don't turn their back and say, oh man, what a loser, we shouldn't have put him on the line, what a mistake. No, they go up to that player and they pat him on the back, or they give him a high, a middle, or a low five. They say words of encouragement because it's when we're at our lowest that we need somebody to help lift us up. And I think that's what the story is saying. When we are all at our lowest, when we are all so desperately in need of God's help, even when we disagree on how to get to the goal, we need to be lifting each other up rather than putting each other down. It's one of the things I like about basketball. It's one of the few sports where the teams congratulate each other at the end of the game. They greet each other. Baseball, they greet each one on their team, not the other team. But basketball is where they greet each other because they know they're on the same side. You just want to play the game well. If the score happens to be in your favor, don't worry, next time it won't be. That's kind of like life, isn't it? When the score is in our favor, don't worry, the next time it won't be. It's so easy to compare our faithful selves to others, especially when we know that in our heart of hearts, we're going to find the other one wanting. It's so easy to compare ourselves to others who hold different beliefs and different views so that we can find them wanting. Rather than compare, perhaps we can remember we're in this life together. We're on this planet together. We're helping God build the kingdom of heaven on earth together. It's easy to compare, but it's even easier to stop comparing, to stop putting down, and to begin to lift each other up in prayer, action, attitude, and word. Because after all, we are not that great. They aren't that bad. And God wants what is best for all of us. Amen.